You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 22nd of May 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, the US and some European countries are at odds over the ICC arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas leaders. We'll have analysis over the crisis in the Middle East. Finland has proposed a new law to stop migrants entering from Russia. The latest member of NATO says the Kremlin is facilitating a wave of asylum seekers, which it fears will increase in the warmer months. Then,
ultimately, what makes humans such a successful species is our curiosity. It's what makes us look over the horizon to discover new territories, new resources, new opportunities.
We'll hear about the latest World Economic Forum travel and tourism study and examine the vibrancy of the art scene in Senegal. We'll have a flick through the day's papers, a roundup of news from the world of architecture and design, and then
it gives me great pleasure to announce the winner of the International Booker Prize 2024 is Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck, translated by Michael Hoffman.
The winners of the prestigious literary award will join me live in the studio. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. The Israeli authorities confiscated camera equipment belonging to the Associated Press before reversing course in the face of widespread condemnation from media groups and criticism even from its closest ally, the United States. Vietnam's parliament elected Police Minister To Lam as the state president on Wednesday in a move analysts see as a stepping stone for Lam to bid later for the position of chief of the ruling Communist Party, the country's top job. And New Zealand's Conservative government will cut military spending by 6.6%, according to the Defence Minister's office, even as the armed forces struggle with ageing equipment, a shortage of manpower and ambitions for a greater regional role. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, the arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas leaders issued by the chief prosecutor of the world's top war crimes court have been backed by 3 European countries, including key ally France. The ICC accuses Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his defence minister, and 3 Hamas leaders of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Gaza Strip and in Israel. Well, I'm joined now by Julie Norman, who's a lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL and co-director of UCL Centre on US Politics. Julie, many thanks for coming back on the show. Who supports these arrests and what does it tell us about the divisions in the West's approach to Israel?
Well, good morning. I would say these arrest warrants have had a mixed response from different allies around the world. Obviously, the United States, as one would probably expect, has been very critical of the announcement of the warrants. President Biden described them as outrageous. Many in Congress are actually moving to even sanction the ICC itself and some of the members of the prosecution office. And let's remember that the United States is not a party member to the ICC. In Europe, the picture is a little bit different. It's a bit more mixed. We have heard more critical responses from the UK, from Rishi Sunak, but phrased more in terms of their helpfulness for the conflict, saying these are simply unhelpful warrants. And on the other end, countries like France, several other countries in the EU, Belgium, who are saying, look, this is the court acting in the way it's supposed to. It's showing that it's not partial and it's exercising what it's supposed to do in trying to hold different individuals accountable when there are war crimes or crimes against humanity. So we're really seeing the full gamut.
The Israeli foreign minister went to France. How did the discussions on the subject of arrest play out there?
Yeah, well, as one would expect, there are sharp differences between how Israel is seeing these warrants from much of the rest of the world. Again, Israel also is not a party to the court. They question the court's even jurisdiction over this matter and see the warrants as anti-Semitic, as a moral outrage, and as simply being ungrounded. So this is certainly going to put a rift, I think, between them and countries that are supporting the warrant, and that includes France.
Yeah, I just want to cycle back to what you were saying about the US. So we know that Antony Blinken's told a congressional hearing that he's committed to taking action against what he calls a profoundly wrong-headed decision, meaning the ICC decision. He said that just as there comes this big Republican push to impose sanctions on ICC officials, they might vote on it even this week. As you say, the US isn't a member of the ICC. They have previously backed the court's decisions. Biden, of course, supports Israel on the separate case on alleged genocide at the ICJ. But we were thinking that there was a possible rupture between Israel and the US, particularly over Rafah. Does this mean that they're getting closer once again?
Well, yes, I think this current week, I think, shows how complicated the relationship has become, because at the end of the day, Democrats and Republicans, at least the Biden administration, still sees Israel as a close ally. They still are defending Israel's right to defend itself, and overall are defending Israel's right to conduct this war in Gaza. What they disagree with is how the war is being conducted, some of the tactics that are being used, and what they see as an overall lack of strategy. So that has obviously come out in the open. The Biden administration, has been very vocal, like most of the world, in opposing a major incursion into Rafah. But on some of these, what they see as bigger picture issues in terms of Israel's right to defend itself, there you still see that quote unquote ironclad support coming back into the picture. So I think it can appear a bit flip-floppy to many around the world, even to many Americans, but to the Biden administration, they're trying to kind of thread this needle in this way.
Well, how significant, though, is their shifting position when you put it alongside the idea of the upcoming election?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very notable. I would say recent polls just that came out this week show that most Americans are quite frustrated with the Biden administration's handling, and that comes from those who sympathize with Palestinians, those who sympathize with Israel, and those who are kind of in the middle. I think that's largely to do with many feeling that he's not doing enough on either side and is trying to walk this middle line and is thus not really pleasing anyone in the process. At the end of the day, I would say this issue alone will probably not tip the elections, but we know that it is going to alienate at least some Democrats from supporting Biden in ways they might have otherwise.
And what about the relationship now between the US and the EU? Because they do seem to be pretty divided on this.
They do. And actually, it's interesting, Georgina, because the US, as you noted before, had started to support the court a bit more openly under Biden, especially in terms of the investigations into Putin and the Ukraine war. And then with the warrants announced this week, we see a very sharp divergence around the approach to Israel and Gaza and around the use of the courts and the use of the warrants in particular. So I do think this divide is something that is probably going to remain and probably just expand as these investigations and warrants likely move forward. And of course, if there is a change in presidency, we would, of course, see even a bigger rift in that regard.
And how meaningful are these arrest warrants in terms of actually seeing anyone incarcerated?
Yeah. So again, these warrants are a first step. The warrants themselves even need to be approved through a pretrial panel that most likely will happen. But as most of your listeners know, the court itself cannot go and arrest people who are charged, nor can they try individuals in absence. And so what usually this means is it just means usually very strict travel restrictions and movement restrictions on those who are accused. If they were to travel to a member state, that member state would be obligated to arrest and extradite them. If they stay where they are, they often can remain there, untried for years. So it would definitely restrict travel. And that's a big thing for Israeli leaders in particular, to not be able to travel to, say, Europe. But in terms of actual arrest and trial, that would be unlikely in any near future.
Julie, we've been reporting in our headlines about Israeli officials seizing a camera and broadcasting equipment that belonged to the Associated Press. That happened in southern Israel on Tuesday. They said the news organisation had violated a new media law by providing images to the TV network Al Jazeera. But now that's just been reversed, I think because of mounting international pressure. But tell us more about this incident and why the turnaround.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Israel's restrictions on journalists in this conflict have been getting ongoing attention. There were certainly attention several weeks ago when Israel essentially banned Al Jazeera. And in this latest incident, the equipment of Associated Press was seized. And essentially, Associated Press had cameras set up in southern Israel, keeping a live feed of Gaza. And outlets around the world were using that footage, including but not limited to Al Jazeera. So that was Israel's rationale through this new kind of foreign media law. As you know, the blowback was very vocal, very strong from around the world, including from allies, including like the U.S. And so this has apparently been reversed. But I do think that it just underscores the challenges that Israel is having with maintaining any kinds of goodwill, good relations with much of the media world, with much of the international world in this moment of the war.
And what is the new law that's been brought in? What does it actually say about restrictions on media?
Yeah, so this law is one that, again, is kind of built on previous legislation in terms of not sharing images that could be compromising to state security with any foreign outlets that might be sharing it with Israel's adversaries. So Israel does not trust Al Jazeera. They see it as being a sort of conduit, if you will, to Hamas and to other adversaries. Most do not view Al Jazeera that way, I would say, in the media world and internationally. But that has been Israel's position. And I think the law is very much targeted towards that in particular.
Julie, thank you very much indeed. That's Julie Norman there. And this is The Globalist. Twelve minutes past 9 in Helsinki, 7:12 here in London. Now, Finland shares a 1,340-kilometre border with Russia. And last year, after Finland joined NATO, the country shut the frontier when asylum seekers from places such as Syria and Somalia started arriving, encouraged and facilitated by the Kremlin, Finland believes, in an act of revenge. Well, now the Finnish government has proposed emergency legislation to prevent any further migrants from entering the country via the border with Russia. I'm joined now by Charlie Salonius-Pasternak, who's a senior research fellow at the Global Security Research Programme, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. Charlie, it's lovely to talk to you again. What exactly would this proposed law cover?
So what it allows the Finnish authorities in extreme cases to do is to not accept asylum applications. The border has, of course, been closed for all except some goods transports now for many months. This law is viewed as necessary so that if there's a large volume of individuals with the Russian authorities have purposefully pushed across the border, that Finland would simply say, we do not accept your asylum application. There are exceptions, for instance, for children, pregnant women and the elderly and things like this. But fundamentally, it is, of course, in tension with Finland's international obligations to take in asylum seekers.
Exactly. I mean, I wonder how this conforms, that the new law conforms to international human rights commitments.
It is the central tension which all the political debate has been about. But while there have been criticism about it doing so, the government has also been very open, saying that Finland, of course, wants to hold on to its commitments, but it cannot be, as some have termed it, a suicide pact when it's clear that these individuals are not what would be viewed as genuine asylum seekers, rather that they've been instrumentalized. So the Russian authorities, what they've done is they've collected individuals in Russia or engaged people to move them, bust them to the border and pushed them over. So not genuine asylum seekers. And these are the situations where the Finnish authorities now want the legal tools in advance to address this issue if it becomes uncontrollable using kind of normal mechanisms.
Is there any pushback from within Finland?
Certainly there is. There's been a lot of debate about this, criticism both in terms of the law, how it's written itself, as well as the principles. But what we're seeing, again, which is not unusual because security matters find consensus quite a bit more easily than others in Finnish politics, is that even the major opposition parties are saying, okay, we want to have a proper parliamentary debate, but we're certainly not opposed to this, and we understand the reasons and the necessity behind this law. So it's about how it's done rather than the principle. But like in any democracy, there's good debate in parliament.
Now, of course, Finland feels very threatened by Russia and also by Russia's creeping ambition territorially. And there's a breaking news line just out, which actually shows that they have the absolute right to be concerned. Russia's unilaterally moved to change the maritime border with Lithuania and Finland in the Baltic Sea. Tell us more about this.
Well, yeah, this just came out yesterday evening. And fundamentally, Russia is saying these borders, which have worked well, which we've all agreed to, it's now going to change unilaterally. And we don't quite know what the next steps are. My own comments already to this have been Finland should, together with its allies in the Baltic Sea region, but also more broadly, including the UK, do very clear marking that we do not accept this, both politically, diplomatically, but I've also suggested doing so-called freedom of navigation operations, what the US and UK have done in Asia to counter China's equivalent moves, to say we do not accept this. This is not the way borders are moved, because if we accept it, then of course, what's there to stop from Russia to say, you know, Finland, there's this little territory on land where we're also going to change the border. So it's a principle question rather than a practical question at this moment, but certainly worrying and certainly something that must be addressed quite quickly.
And of course, I mean, Finland's a NATO member. I mean, if there is a pushback, could this be a spark for a huge international incident?
Well, of course, we are hoping not. What Russia frequently does, and this may be one of those cases, is it does something fairly inexpensively, announcing it's going to do something dramatic. And when it sees pushback from us, it stops and pulls back. So if I think we politically, diplomatically, and again through actions, make it clear that we do not accept your new interpretation of the borders, they contravene the internationally recognized borders, Russia may simply just withdraw and stop. But if we do not do anything, then Russia's modus operandi tends to be it will just continue pushing. And then there'll be another maritime location, then maybe a land location. So clearly, this is something that the Finnish authorities must discuss with both EU as well as NATO collectively.
Charlie, thank you very much indeed. That's Charlie Salonius-Pasternak. Now, still to come on the programme.
He stands on the platform, lets her embrace him, but doesn't reciprocate. And doesn't start walking either. He waits for the other passengers to disperse, and then he says to Katerina, "I'm taking this train back to Berlin."
A snippet of Kairos, the book originally written in German, which was announced as the winner of the International Booker Prize last night. I'll be chatting to both author and translator. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Now let's continue with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Zoe Grunewald, who is Westminster editor at The Lead. Welcome. It's your first time on Monocle, I believe.
It is. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, it's lovely to have you here. You're Westminster editor. You can tell us all about what's going on in Whitehall. How is Sunak doing, and how is it being reported?
So I think it's safe to say that Sunak seems to be a bit safer than he was perhaps a few months ago, when it looked like the right of his party particularly were kind of moving against him. But what we have in the papers this morning is quite an interesting story about some dissent in the ranks. And this is from one of his ministers, which is Johnny Mercer, the Veterans Minister, who, and this is a great bit of kind of journalism. Somebody sent a picture of Johnny Mercer's email on the train to the Times, which basically said we need to stop putting Rishi Sunak out on the airwaves and we need to put more popular ministers out instead, like Penny Mordaunt, who's the leader of the House, and Kemi Badenoch, who's the Trade Minister. Obviously not something Sunak is going to be best pleased with. It finally seemed like there was some stability in the ranks. And now he's got his own ministers coming out and saying, actually, he's not very popular. We don't want to see very much of him. And it kind of speaks to the fact that I think there's just a feeling in and around number 10 that Sunak is no longer going to really, he's no longer going to be Prime Minister after the next general election.
Well, absolutely right. But in terms of, there's all sorts of stories. For instance, the effect he's had on the trainer market. Samba trainers particular.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure the Adidas are not best pleased by that. And how unfortunate that the Prime Minister of the UK could bring down sales. I mean, it's not really a ringing endorsement for his popularity, is it?
Absolutely not. Right, let's go to Iran now. And, of course, the president who died in a helicopter crash has now been buried. What can you tell us about the international reaction to that?
So there was a piece in the Telegraph this morning that basically said civil servants had instructed or written a memo to ministers to basically show them how to express their condolences for the president's death. But actually, ministers have come back and said, we don't want to do that. We do not want to pay our respects to this man. And obviously, this speaks to these tensions between the UK and Iran. And although there have been constructive dialogues between the two states in the past, ministers such as Tom Tugendhat, who's the security minister, has basically said, I don't want to pass on my respects. You know, I feel bad about the incident, but I don't want to say this is a man we'll greatly miss. And I think, obviously, with the unfolding conflict in the Middle East, this has become a real point of contention. And many people hold him responsible for the kind of, for the political violence against political prisoners, for the treatment of women in Iran. And I think British ministers particularly do not want people to think that they are in any way kind of allowing or accepting the kind of treatment he placed on his own people.
Of course, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is 85 years old, and this has really thrown into the spotlight who will replace him with the death of Raisi. I mean, what is the future of Iran? Does it continue along the same path?
It's really interesting because there's so much global instability, and there's so much instability, particularly in the Middle East. And I think there is concerns and questions over what's next for Iran. It's ever since, COVID placed a lot of shocks on the economy. It's still just recovering, but then there's all sorts of political tensions bubbling below the surface. There's lots of oppression in Iran. And I think there is always a worry when something like this, when there's a ruler who really kind of ruled with an iron fist, dies, there's always a question about what comes after.
And many analysts, though, are saying really we shouldn't expect any major change in terms of the sort of hardline politics.
Absolutely. I think Iran has been quite an oppressive state for a long time, and I don't think there's any kind of ideological challenge there. I think we can expect continuity. But the question about who will replace and whether there will be differences, and particularly in their approach to kind of international events, looking over at Israel and things like that, whether that will change for the better or whether that will change for the worse.
Let's look at health news now, because we're told from a new report tells us that more than 2,500 attacks last year on medics or clinics bombed, basically health workers in conflict.
Absolutely. So attacks on health workers, hospitals and clinics in conflict zones jumped about 25% last year, which is the highest level on record. And this is a new report that's basically come out and said it's getting particularly bad for medics, for trained workers in these areas. And they point to the situation in Gaza, they point to points of conflict in Africa, and they say actually there seems to not only be deliberate targeted attacks on health and aid workers, but also these attacks are happening also by accident, carelessness. And one of the recommendations this report makes is that actually there needs to be much stronger international action against those who do target aid workers in order to act as a deterrent.
So this is a coalition that have come together to produce this. It's more than 40 non-governmental organisations, I understand.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And they produced annual reports on this for the last sort of 11 years or so. And Leonard Rubinstein, he's the chair of the coalition. He's from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. He's basically said violence inflicted on these healthcare workers has reached appalling levels. And I think it comes off the back of particularly tense international times. We've seen lots of global conflict. And obviously we saw that appalling attack on aid workers in Gaza not that long ago, which really, I think, drew this into the public mindset. So I think there is going to be more international pressure for the whole international community to come together and really call out these attacks and incidents when they happen.
And there to be some accountability. And of course, it's not just Gaza, it's places like Khartoum too.
Absolutely. So this is not just, Israel, the Middle East. This goes across the world. They talk about Yemen. They talk about Ethiopia as well. And I think it kind of speaks to the fact that actually we're in increasingly really hostile times, and there are lots and lots of different conflicts going on across the world, not just over territory, but over energy, over environmental issues as well. And I think, as we know, these are only going to worsen as the sort of global state gets more and more kind of frenetic. So absolutely, this is a really major intervention, and hopefully something that those kind of big organisations will take seriously.
Now, I love a bit of property porn, but this story, and particularly the way The Guardian frames it, makes it seem absolutely outrageous. So this is all about a new property show made on British television. It's kind of like, I suppose, a British version of Selling Sunset. Tell us more.
That's absolutely correct. So this is yes, as you say, this is called Buying London. The Guardian have called it probably the most hateable TV show ever made. And they make a really interesting point, because although Selling Sunset was particularly popular, people love seeing these vast, expansive houses in LA, there's a point to be made about the fact that the UK is experiencing such an acute housing shortage. There was an interesting stat in here that 25% of people, after they've paid their housing costs, are in poverty. The idea that we would all kind of gawk at housing porn, as you say, in the UK, I think is actually, many people find it quite objectionable when they know that actually housing is such a point of contention for so many people. It's really destructive on people's budgets, on people's lives. And to kind of make light of the situation and talk about this kind of mass inequality between housing standards in people in the UK, I think, I just don't think it's gone down particularly well with the UK audience.
Yeah, and so the crew that do the selling, it's headed by the improbably named Daniel Daggers, and they all have impossibly kind of precise cheekbones. They're very coiffed. But there have been many articles about them recently, and lots of kind of photo spreads of these very glamorous people who sell properties in excess of £10 million and only work on commission. So there's no salary there. So they are absolutely driven to sell these things if they want to make any money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just going back to the point that there is just such a vast inequality between housing standards here in the UK. And as you say, it's kind of making light of that. We know that there is just, especially in London, extraordinarily priced properties. And then there are people just around the corner, a quarter of a mile away, living in extreme poverty. And I think people are really waking up to this kind of level of inequality, especially in London, and how actually not only is housing incredibly expensive, but it can be really destructive on people's health, people's life. And I think, this feels to many people slightly tasteless.
Yeah, the review by Rebecca Nicholson is actually really quite funny, and it ends, she says, "I suspect that Buying London has been produced with at least some concession that it will be watched not with joy but with rage. In that respect, I bow to Netflix, who have manipulated me into a state of mild fury. Then again, this could be radical left-wing propaganda in disguise. Is the Trojan horse, or house, that finally ends our passive acceptance of billionaires and exposes the notion that we could all have our own gigantic bird bath if we just work hard enough, as the enormous con that it is." I love that review.
It's fantastic, isn't it? I think she's really, really onto something there. It's people love to hate watch, don't they?
Definitely, yeah. Although I've can't say that I don't feel a little avaricious about it.
Yeah, well, me too.
Zoe Grunwald, thank you very much indeed. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. The Israeli authorities confiscated camera equipment belonging to the Associated Press before reversing course in the face of widespread condemnation from media groups and criticism even from its closest ally, the United States. Washington asked senior Israeli officials to backtrack, saying the free press is an essential pillar of democracy and members of the media do vital work that must be respected. Vietnam's parliament elected Police Minister To Lam as the state president on Wednesday, in a move analysts see as a stepping stone for Lam to bid later for the position of chief of the ruling Communist Party, the country's top job. Lam's election followed the appointment on Monday by Vietnam's National Assembly of its new chairman, former deputy Tran Tan Man, possibly bringing to a temporary end 2 months of heightened political turbulence, which saw the exit of 3 of Vietnam's top 5 leaders over unspecified wrongdoings. And New Zealand's Conservative government will cut military spending by 6.6%, according to the Defence Minister's office, even as the armed forces struggle with ageing equipment, a shortage of manpower and ambitions for a greater regional role. The cuts put New Zealand at odds with many of its traditional partners, such as Australia and Japan, which are ramping up spending in response to China's growing military presence in the region. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. The latest World Economic Forum travel and tourism study has been released, confirming a return to pre-pandemic tourist levels this year, with some countries performing better than others. USA, Spain and Japan have the highest recovery rates in international tourist arrivals. Monocle's Tom Webb sat down with the writer and broadcaster Ash Bhardwaj to find out more about the appeal of the 3 countries, as well as the big question asked and answered in his new book, Why We Travel.
Travel's deeply instinctive. The motivations that drive us, and there are 12 of them as I talk about in the book, but the key ones of curiosity, inspiration and wonder are what makes us want to leave home and go and see other places. Not only do we enjoy the place in and of itself, but it allows us to reflect on ourselves and understand who we are better. It makes our life more fulfilling. And these 3 countries that are bouncing back the strongest, USA, Spain and Japan, they do it all for slightly different reasons. The USA has long been one of the most popular tourist destinations for the UK. It's easy to access because there's good flights. It's easy to access from a visa perspective. They speak English everywhere, and that makes it easy to travel around. Good information. And there's a lot of diversity within the United States. Cultural diversity, environmental diversity. Spain is the original overseas destination from the UK. Again, excellent resources, excellent infrastructure. It's very well known, comparatively affordable, usually good weather, so that's always going to be popular. Japan is perhaps the most interesting one because the language can be a barrier when you're traveling around Japan. So why is it that Japan is really having this moment in the zeitgeist? There's a couple of different reasons. When you look at Japan, externally it looks quite familiar. A very well-developed nation, big buildings, excellent infrastructure. But culturally, when you peel back the surface, it is different. And I think that's interesting and exciting. One of the motivations I talk about in the book is eroticism. And it's not sex tourism. Eroticism is a term that I discovered from a relation psychotherapist, Esther Perel. And she talks about eroticism as a gap between self and other. It's that sense of aliveness and surprise that makes you feel alive. That's what you find so exciting when you meet somebody new. And it's the same with travel. And this is why Japan is so exciting. It's accessible because it's so well developed, the infrastructure is so good and so on. But that difference just makes you feel excited and curious about the world, whether it's the food, whether it's the way people go out drinking in the evening, whether it's the way people work, whether it's the hobbies. That's what makes Japan such an exciting place. The landscape is phenomenal. Hokkaido in the north is one of my favourite places to visit. And you feel like you're in Hyrule from The Legend of Zelda. Actually, Shigeru Miyamoto, the man that designed Zelda, based it on the landscape of Japan. And wandering around there, you kind of expect forest sprites or fairies to appear. It really is a magical place. Mountain ranges, volcanoes, forests, bare-filled forests, incredible coastline. It's an amazing place to go and spend time.
I'm there now in the world of Zelda. Thank you for painting that picture for us. You've painted a very good picture about why we travel to Spain and the US and Japan. But why do we travel in general? Your book looks at motivations for travel, and you do answer the question why we travel. Can you do that in a broader way for us?
Ultimately, what makes humans such a successful species is our curiosity. It's what makes us look over the horizon to discover new territories, new resources, new opportunities. But we're also able to adapt to those environments, whereas other species have to genetically evolve to move into a colder or warmer environment. Humans use tools and resources around them to make clothes, make fire, make housing. And that curiosity is deeply embedded in us, and it makes us want to just go and see other places. So that's why travel is so deeply embedded in us. Inspiration is when you hear other people's stories or you learn about a place and you want to go and find more about it. Happiness is quite an obvious one, you might think. Hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. But there's also a sense of purpose. Sometimes you want to go somewhere to do something. And there's 9 others. But the ones that really stick out are wonder, which is that desire to just see something remarkable and feel very different.
And another one that you mention is that how travel can lead to empathy, which I think is a really, really lovely term and something I never thought about. How do you illustrate this in the book?
In 2017, I'd gone to Estonia with the British Army Reserve. I'm a captain in the Rifles, and we were there as part of this deterrence operation with NATO. And I became very curious about the legacy of Soviet and Russian occupation in Europe and how Russia, or the Kremlin, was instrumentalizing it, using it to stir up debate and dissent around identity and history. So I spent 6 months travelling 8,500 kilometres from the top of Norway, a place called Kirkenes, through Finland, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kaliningrad, Poland, Belarus, Transnistria, Moldova, Ukraine. And along the way, I just wanted to understand, how do people feel about these questions of identity and history? And I encountered some people who felt very Ukrainian, that Russia's invasion in 2014, when they first invaded Ukraine, had really consolidated their sense of Ukrainianness. And I met some Russian Latvians who wanted Putin to do to Latvia what he had done to Crimea. And empathy is about understanding the emotions that drive beliefs and behaviours. How did people come to this belief? And you may not agree with it, but I think it's important to understand it. And the only way that I have found to do that is by meeting people in their place and being open to their beliefs.
So we can travel better with a sense of empathy. If we look back at the World Economic Forum report, it talks about the picture for travel is not all rosy. There's some geopolitical issues that you mentioned, but also some environmental issues. You look at how we can travel better from an environmental perspective, and what is some of the solutions that you have?
Well, it might be the hubris of me having travelled a lot of the world already, but I do think that the most enjoyable and fulfilling travel doesn't come from travelling further necessarily, and it doesn't come from spending more money, certainly not. For me, my most enjoyable travel has usually been slow travel overland, travelling by train. I travelled around most of that journey through Norway down to Crimea on trains or on buses. I didn't fly, and that gave me more time to enjoy the places I was in and see the change of environment, of culture, and to speak to people. The other two aspects of sustainability are the amount that you're consuming when you're travelling somewhere. So if you're going to, Iceland, and you're eating a lot of beef and drinking Argentinian wine, then that product has had a lot of carbon footprint to get there. Whereas if you're eating lamb or things that are grown in Icelandic greenhouses or drinking local Icelandic beer, you're not going to be using as much of a carbon footprint because you're eating locally. And then the third thing is the social sustainability. So if you are looking at somewhere like Ibiza, how has Ibiza evolved over the last 75, 80 years? It's gone from being a fairly subsistence fishing island to being one of the most expensive places in the world, one of the highest concentrations of wealth. Now, a lot of people have made plenty of money out of that, and I can't speak for Ibethans, or Elvitans as they're also known, for how they feel about that. But I do know from ones that I have spoken that there's pros and cons to this. The entire island is framed around serving tourists rather than necessarily the needs of locals. And so that social sustainability has a big impact. Are you travelling in a way that is working with the place that you're visiting, or is the type of tourism you're engaging in damaging the local social structure?
Ash Bajwa there, and his book Why We Travel is out now. You're with Monocle Radio. It's 7:39 here in London, that's 8:39 in Zurich. As the Oscars are to film and the Grammys are to music, so are the Booker Prizes to literature. The International Booker Prize is awarded annually for the finest single work of fiction from around the world which has been translated into English and published in the UK or Ireland. The prize celebrates the vital work of translators, with the £50,000 prize money divided equally between the author and the translator. Well, this year's prize was announced at a glittering ceremony sponsored by Maison Valentino at London's Tate Modern last night. I was there and it was quite the party, so I know how difficult it must have been for the winners to be up and here with me in the studio. Jenny Erpenbeck and Michael Hoffman, many congratulations. Jenny, you're the first German novelist to win the award. Michael, you're the first male translator to receive the honour. The two of you seemed genuinely blindsided by your win last night. Jenny, was it a complete surprise?
Yeah, of course. You wouldn't prepare to get it. You would try your best to stay calm and to not expect anything. So of course it was a surprise to you wait for the title and then it's the title of your own book and you cannot believe. Yeah.
Michael, I think that yours was the best acceptance speech I've ever heard. Would you reprise it for us?
Well, it was a sort of blurred. I mean, Jenny spoke freely. I brought my spectacles and I had a piece of paper with my scrawl in my pocket, but I thought I couldn't read anything after Jenny spoke. So I just spoke out of my own astonishment. And I suppose also sort of out of the invisibility and kind of absence of translators. There is no real way of thinking about them. I mean, not in English, because English is such a sort of overmastering and solipsistic language. I think I would even say there's very little tolerance for translation, or the idea of translation, or any separate noise made by translators.
So, I mean, this is a really vital prize then, to make sure that this is highlighted.
I think for me, psychically, personally, it would have been a catastrophe not to win it, I must say.
Well, I mean, you're considered, though, you're considered one of the best translators in the world. You've won so many prizes.
Confidence is such a... I mean, I had... among my remarks that stayed in my pocket, I had a thought about the composer, Anton Bruckner, who would put himself through exams in harmony and counterpoint, who'd had symphonies and whatnot put on. He was a sort of acknowledged great composer, but he would take exams into his 60s or whatever. I sort of feel I understand that, and you're always when you begin something again, you're always a beginner.
Jenny, tell us about the premise of the book.
The book is both a love story and a political story too. So it's a love story taking place in the late 80s, beginning 90s in East Berlin. So the fall of the wall happens at some point in the book. What is in the background in the beginning, so the slow motion towards all the complex change, moves into the foreground slowly and is getting mixed up with the private story. And what I tried is to explore the difficulties, private relationship where lies and truth play a big role. And you will see the same structures in the political context too. And what I tried is to understand it a bit better.
Once the book is in a different language, do you think of it still as your work, or does it take on a different entity?
No, I think of it as my work. As my work, the English. No, it reads well, and I already had some readings of the English version, and I could see that it's still my book. And of course, it's Michael's language, not mine.
And how does that process? I mean, do you have to read it several times? Do you do it as you go along?
My own is something I've arrived at over 40 years, which is to translate as sort of as quickly and roughly as I may, and then work from the English many times. And this was sort of compounded in our case. I have mostly worked from 20th century German classics, and my previous victims were all dead. But Jenny pointed out that I'd left her meaning in some places, particularly that I'd missed or failed to signal repetitions. Echoes, sort of leitmotif, things sort of played again backwards, and so those were sort of incorporated, and we sort of hammered together a text.
Well, it's a wonderful text, and obviously the judges of the prize thought that too. We are very lucky here that we do get a lot of translated literature, but not nearly enough. And I wonder how that works in Germany. Do you get a lot of books in English?
We do. Yeah, we read a lot translated literature. It's very normal to read translated versions of foreign literature, and we would we would never have this idea that it is strange, or that it is like literature is universal. So if you read a book, and you of course there are better translations or worse translations. And you could also sometimes get a feeling that this was like a translated text, but mostly they have good people to do this, and it will read as well as it would do in German.
Jenny, many congratulations to you and to you, Michael. That's Jenny Erpenbeck and Michael Hoffman. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. It's time now to talk design and architecture with Tim Abrahams, who's contributing editor at Architectural Record. He joins us on the line now. Tim, we're going to start with the Chelsea Flower Show. Tell us what you saw there and what it's looking like this year.
Yesterday I was very jealous of the fact that I wasn't actually at the Chelsea Flower Show. I've been watching the BBC's absolutely wall-to-wall coverage of it. It's like Glastonbury for the suburban man. It's amazing. I just kind of I've been glued to it. And today, I don't know what it's like in London. Out here in the suburbs, it's absolutely hosing it down. So I am very grateful I'm not there, and I'm glad for the BBC. But the thing that I've been watching as I've been looking out for moments of design in a classic sense, the making of stuff, and I've been enjoying seeing my friend Jay Ann from Studio Weave do a garden for WaterAid with Tom Massey, which I wonder what is like today. It's effectively a wonderful pavilion of these strange parasols which filter water down through desert plants into a more lush kind of garden landscape. So there's all these kind of incidents and moments throughout the whole thing, and when you're glued to it as I am, you can find all manner of things. But yeah, I love it.
Let's talk about Rotterdam, because you've just come back from there, and there's a lot of parks going on, parkification, if you like.
Yes, well, this is what put me in mind of the Chelsea Flower Show, which is like London's Design Week in many ways. In Rotterdam, what we're seeing is a more kind of urban scale introduction of flora and fauna into the city. There are 8 parks planned to be opened, one a year, I think, over the next 8 years. The first one, which I saw, was in Kielhaven, which is effectively rendering an industrial dock into an urban beach. This also creates this wonderful facility for a lot of the new offices which are moving in there, converting old warehouses and so on. But it's also increasing the capacity of the city to be able to absorb high water. So there, within the new beach, there is also for it to be able to handle excess rainwater at a pinch point within the harbour. And you see that throughout Rotterdam. These new parks are all beautiful new aspects of the city. They provide a social function, but they're also there to deal with a water management issue and an environmental issue.
And let's talk about now the Carbuncle Cup.
Indeed, from the beautiful to the ugly. The Carbuncle Cup was first established in 2000 in Scotland by an architectural writer and now academic, Penny Lewis. It was then, when the magazine she was working for closed, it was taken up by the building design, and the worst building of the year was granted a prize, the Carbuncle Cup, annually, all the way up into 2018. And the literary magazine The Fence has resurrected it and is asking for nominations for the worst building built in the UK since 2018. And a judging panel of architectural notaries, including Vicky Richardson, who is the curator of architecture and design at the Royal Academy, will gather together and select the building which deserves the Carbuncle Cup, named, of course, after Prince Charles's remark about the extension of the National Gallery being like a carbuncle on the face of a long-loved friend.
So we could all get involved. We could all nominate this. It's got to be a building after 2018.
Yeah, that was the last time. 31st of August 2018 was the last time the award was handed out. We want to bring it back up to date, possibly kind of continue to do it every year. I'm slightly involved in the. I'm chairing the panel. So the idea is that it's brought back up to date, and we can all use the award for encouragement for better urban design. I think you can be too negative with these things. Of course, it's a worst, but you can use it for good, I think. That's what we intend to do.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Tim Abrams there. And you're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. As Africa's biggest art biennale, Dakar is always eagerly anticipated. So when Senegal's Culture Ministry announced that this year's edition was postponed just 3 weeks before its opening, there was consternation, not least amongst the 58 African and diaspora artists invited to take part. But Dakar's independent art scene was having none of it. And the city has managed to get its act together by itself. Mary Fitzgerald, Monocle's North Africa correspondent, joins us now. Mary, why was it postponed?
Well, according to staff of the Biennale, cited in various media outlets, they basically say that the previous government, so a new government was elected in March, did not honour funding promises for the event. And they also said that there were issues in transporting artworks through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea after Houthi militants in Yemen began targeting ships there. So a lot of kind of reasons put out there in the mix, if you like. The ministry itself, when it announced that it was being postponed until November, cited what it called the constraints and hazards of the national and international context, but didn't give further details. I just returned from Dakar. I arrived there last week for the beginning of opening week, what was supposed to be the opening week of the Biennale proper. But as you mentioned, the independent art scene in Dakar decided to essentially salvage what it could of the off Biennale program, which means that basically for the next month, Dakar will play host to hundreds of events, from installations to film screenings, dinners, pop-ups, different exhibitions. So there was a real buzz in the city over the past week, and a real sense that while the Biennale, of course, people were disappointed that it was postponed, that this was still happening.
Absolutely. Tell us about some of the highlights that you enjoyed while you were there.
So I was really struck by the number of artists in the OFF program who were basically exploring Afro-diasporic identities. So a lot of artists coming from hybrid identity backgrounds themselves. There was one really interesting exhibition by German-born Ghanaian artist Zohra Opoku, very much working on textiles to tell the story of her mixed heritage. So I found that fascinating, and that seemed to be a theme in many of the exhibitions. There was also an exhibition by artists who have completed residencies at Black Rock, which is a program in Dakar which was founded in 2019 by US artist Kehinde Wiley. And also Wiley himself, he had an exhibition at Dakar's flagship Museum of Black Civilizations, which is basically, his exhibition is a series of portraits of African heads of state that he had started on in 2012. So that was really interesting as well.
How big a deal is Dakar in the international art world?
Well, it's been running since the late 90s. This is the first time it's been postponed, and it has really gained momentum in recent years. You know, there has been a real uptick in interest in art by African artists from the African diaspora, and Dakar has really kind of seized the momentum in that respect. Dakar, of course, is so much a hub for Africa's creative sector. People often say that if you're young, Francophone African and involved in the creative sector, you will gravitate towards Dakar. One person said to me last week, it's like a Berlin, if you like, for Francophone Africa. So there's a lot of creative energy there. There are a lot of opportunities for artists and other creatives there. And there's really a buzz in the city, whether, you know, during the Biennale or not.
So, I mean, this wasn't the real thing, but to all intents and purposes, did it feel like it?
Well, an off program is always, for any Biennale is always kind of, it's quirkier. It's set in different places to the big spaces of a Biennale. So it has its own kind of flavor, if you like. I think people will be very interested to see the Biennale proper in November in terms of the scale of its ambition. I was struck when I was in Dakar last October. A lot of curators were telling me, you have to come back for the Biennale. It's going to be the most political Dakar yet in terms of the themes, the focus, and that will, I think, still be the case in November. But it will be interesting to see how a program around the Biennale in November works now, given that the OFF program has been maintained this month.
Mary, thank you very much indeed. That's Mary Fitzgerald there. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Vincent McAviney, Tom Webb and Monica Lillis, our researcher, George Ruskin, and our studio manager, Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and the briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.